boy raised a gun at the man, who just called him Dad. But just before he pulled the trigger, a dog leapt forward, taking the bullet. Amid red blood-white snow and shattered memories, the father collapsed in tears as the child whispered, "Dad, is it really you?" No one knew where Shadow came from. But that doggy was the key that unlocked hell. Subscribe now to never miss the next gripping and emotional chapter of our films. The wind howled like a living thing outside, angry and desperate. Snow slapped against the windows in relentless waves, and the trees beyond the clearing bent beneath the weight of a punishing Wyoming blizzard. Midnight bled into the storm without a sound. Inside the cabin, the world was frozen in stillness. Fire crackling low in the hearth, a mug of untouched coffee trembling on a wooden table. Logan Harris sat in the corner, in the old rocking chair that used to be his wife's. The flicker of flame traced the hard lines of his face, painting ghosts on the walls behind him. He didn't blink. Not when the lights flickered from the wind. Not when the rafters creaked overhead. He was somewhere else, locked inside a memory where it was always burning, where her voice still called out, and the laughter of a boy echoed down smoke-filled hallways. 4 years. That's how long it had been since the Columbia mission went sideways. Since the detonation. Since he was told there were no survivors, no Emily, no Ben. He never buried them. Not because he didn't want to, but because there was nothing left to bury. A sharp, sudden sound tore through the storm, claws against wood. He froze. Another, scrape, scratch, then silence. He stood slowly, reached instinctively for the pistol that still lived in the drawer near the door. The motion was muscle memory, not thought. More scratching. He moved toward the entrance boots, silent against the hardwood. The sound came again, more urgent now. He paused at the threshold. His heart didn't race. It hadn't in years. Not since the night the fire took everything. With one swift motion, he opened the door. The cold slammed into him like a punch. And standing there still as a gravestone was a black Malinois snow caked along its back frost. On its muzzle eyes, the color of dying embers. The dog didn't bark, didn't flinch. Logan blinked, stunned by the sight. It wasn't the dog's size or the raw intensity of its gaze that unsettled him. It was the thing hanging from its neck, a leather pouch, blood-stained, weathered, tied to a small steel clasp. The dog stepped forward, not threatening, just deliberate, and then it collapsed. Logan dropped to one knee. It was lean, but not starving. Muscular, scarred, trained. Someone's dog, no more than that. Someone's partner. He reached for the pouch, hesitation slicing through him. But the dog didn't resist. It only watched. Inside the pouch was a USB drive. No label, no mark. But the leather, it was military spec. He'd used the same kind during his years in covert operations. And the blood, still tacky. He stood scooping the dog into his arms. The Malinois groaned, but didn't resist. Inside, the fire groaned louder, throwing heat into the room as the storm raged behind the closing door. Logan laid the dog gently on an old wool blanket, checked its paws, cut frostbitten. Its ribs rose and fell, slow, labored, but not dying. The animal had been through hell, but it was a fighter. Just like them. He plugged in the USB. The screen flickered. Then it began to play. At first only static. Then video. Grainy. Black and white. A handheld feed. Moving through dense brush. Low to the ground, as if the camera was mounted to something. Someone crawling. Children. Barefoot, dirty, chained into one another by the wrist. A woman's voice in Spanish screamed something off camera. One boy tripped. Another lifted him. The feed panned upward, catching a symbol on a tattered canvas wall. A jagged serpent curled into itself. Logan's breath caught. He knew that symbol. He had burned that symbol, or thought he had. 4 years ago, they'd raided a stronghold outside Medellin. Intelligence had linked it to arms trafficking. But what they'd found, children in cages, mock training grounds, psychological warfare sessions, they weren't preparing insurgents. They were manufacturing soldiers. Child soldiers. And that symbol, the serpent, was the sigil of Project Ethon, a black ops nightmare created in the Cold War, abandoned, buried, and apparently resurrected. He had seen the final report. He had watched it burn in front of his handler. Ethan was dead. And yet, there it was, clear as day. The camera shifted again. The children were now in a dim room, lit only by a single bulb swaying from the ceiling. A man barked orders in English. 2 children were forced to dismantle and reassemble rifles on a ticking clock. A girl was punished, beaten with a shock prod when she failed to clear the chamber properly. Logan swallowed bile. He paused the video, closed his eyes. The fire cracked behind him. He fast-forwarded. There another shot, a closer view. One of the children had fallen asleep in a corner. His shirt had torn, revealing a tattoo along his shoulder blade. A serpent, same sigil, and beneath it numbers, 6 digits, just like the tags used in the original Ethan registry. Only one of those numbers seared its way into Logan's vision. 17-19B. He staggered back. His hand reached into the drawer again, but not for the gun. For a photograph, faded, water-stained, folded 100 times. Ben, 7 years old. Wide smile. Dirt on his chin from the campsite that weekend. He turned the photo over. Written in Emily's handwriting, Ben 17-19B, birthday registry code. His blood froze. Not a coincidence. The number on the boy's shoulder. It wasn't just a number. It was Ben, his son. Logan stood, fists clenched, eyes hollow. The dog watched him from the blanket. It hadn't moved. It didn't need to. It had brought him this. It had found him after all these years. "Who sent you?" Logan whispered. The dog blinked, and then slowly, it tried to rise. Its legs trembled, but it stood. It stepped forward, staring directly at him. Like it understood. Like it remembered. Then it turned toward the door and waited. The snow howled outside. Logan stared at the screen one last time. The image frozen on his son's back, tattooed and forgotten. He grabbed the photo, folded it, stuffed it into his coat pocket. The USB went into his dog tag case, the pistol into the holster under his belt. He moved fast, boots packed, gloves, knives, flares. Shadow, the name, carved into the dog's tag. He noticed it now, watched him gear up. And when Logan opened the door again, the wind slapped him once more. This time he welcomed it, because hell was real. And someone had just delivered the key. Shadow stepped into the snow, first limping, but forward. And Logan Harris, father of the lost soldier of the damned, followed without hesitation. The night swallowed them both. But the silence was broken. The snow had eased, but only slightly. Outside, the world was blanketed in a cold so thick, it muffled the sound of everything, even grief. Inside the cabin, the air remained tight. Logan Harris stood motionless in front of the fire, eyes fixed on the photo, now clenched in his hand. The edges were worn. He'd looked at it 1,000 times, maybe more. But now, for the first time in years, the boy's eyes looked back at him with something different truth. Ben, alive, maybe. He turned back to the screen. The final frame of the video still burned like acid in his mind, the serpent tattoo, the numbers, the look of vacant obedience. He could still see the moment the boy flinched from the prod but didn't cry out. Soldiers didn't cry. Soldiers obeyed. Logan had trained men like that once. Now it made his stomach turn. A soft chime broke the silence. It was the antique wall clock. Emily had picked it up from a flea market in Boulder the year they were married. Logan had always hated the thing. Its ticking was too loud, its chime too high-pitched. But she'd loved it. It struck again. Ding, ding. That's when the dog moved. Shadow, still wrapped in a blanket near the hearth, jerked his head sharply to the left, toward the clock. His ears shot upright, body rigid, not in fear, in focus, like a trigger had been pulled. Logan watched closely. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark, just stared, frozen, as if waiting for something else. And then it passed. Shadow blinked, relaxed slightly, and resumed lying down. Logan stepped towards the clock. It looked as it always had, nothing new. But something clawed at the edges of his brain. That sound, that frequency. He grabbed the old digital audio analyzer from a drawer. It still worked barely. He replayed the chime through a recorder, filtered the tones. The analyzer flashed 7.3 key hits, modulated tone detected. Odd. Not just sound. There was a pattern. Military dogs, especially black ops handlers, used sound cues that couldn't be heard by human ears. Frequencies only dogs trained to respond to specific missions could detect. Shadow hadn't reacted to Logan. Not to the warmth. Not even to food. But he'd reacted to that sound. Which meant Logan crouched next to him again, brushing fingers under the fur around the collar. "Let me see you, soldier," he murmured. He unlatched the reinforced clasp, flipped it open, and peeled the leather inward. And there it was. A small metallic chip embedded under the lining. Logan slid it out carefully. It was no larger than a SIM card, but thicker. Embedded inside was a micro GPS transponder, military issue. It was transmitting. Logan stood crossed to his laptop and connected the chip through an adapter. The screen flared to life, with coordinates pulsing against a digital map of the Western Territories. It zoomed in remote terrain in northern Wyoming, nestled between two ridgelines bordering Glacier Pass. No marked trails, no cabins, nothing but rock trees and snow. But the signal was clear, a pulse every 60 seconds. Logan leaned in. "Who sent you?" he whispered again. Shadow said nothing. But he didn't need to. Whoever did this wanted Logan to see that video, to find that signal. And they trusted only one creature on Earth to deliver it, this dog. Logan rose from the chair and walked into the adjacent room. The door groaned as it opened. He hadn't stepped in here for months. His gear was still there, covered in dust and memories. The locker creaked open. Inside, a duffel bag, scuffed black boots, field knife, climbing rope flares. His old FBI issue Glock 19 tucked in a padded case. The same sidearm he'd used in Colombia. He pulled down his service jacket. Still smelled faintly of gun oil and sweat. He slid it on. And in that moment, he wasn't a man mourning his family anymore. He was a hunter, a father, a reckoning. The mirror near the wall offered his reflection grayer. Now more worn, but the fire in his eyes was back. Time to come alive again, he muttered. He returned to the living room. Shadow watched him from the floor, eyes alert. When Logan buckled the last strap on his thigh holster, the dog pushed itself up, limped a step forward, then steadied. He was ready. Logan loaded the GPS coordinates into a handheld tracker-packed rations, thermal blankets, and a compact drone. Snow boots, snowshoes, ice axe. Then one last thing. He opened the top drawer of his wife's old dresser. He reached inside, under the letters she used to write to him during assignments. And there it was. Ben's toy compass, the one he'd insisted on taking during their camping trip that final summer. Logan stared at it for a long moment. The arrow still spun a little slower now. He pocketed it. "You brought me this far," he said to Shadow. "Let's see where else you remember." The wind screamed outside as he opened the door again. Shadow stepped forward first, fur catching moonlight one paw at a time, in fresh snow. Logan followed. Down the hill past the shed and into the dark forest beyond. Each breath was steam. Each step felt heavier than the last. But Logan didn't falter. He couldn't. The past wasn't buried. It was awake. And it had left a trail just clear enough for those willing to bleed for the truth. They reached the base of a ridge an hour later, wind cutting sideways across their faces. The coordinates were still 14 miles northwest. No roads, no airdrops, nothing but terrain maps, compass readings, and instinct. Shadow halted, sniffed the air, then turned away from the mapped path, toward the tree line to the left. Logan hesitated. Checked the map. The path the dog indicated would take them across a narrower ridge, more dangerous terrain. But Shadow didn't hesitate. He moved, because he remembered something Logan didn't. And Logan, without another word, followed. They moved in silence through the snow, step by step. And as they disappeared into the white, Logan couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking not toward a destination, but toward a revelation. The kind that tore your soul open before it ever let you hope. And the dog, this ghost in black fur with too many scars and eyes too old for this world, was leading him there. Not as a guide, but as a witness, because somewhere in that vast, cold wilderness, something had never stopped waiting. And it had sent its sentinel, its shadow, to bring Logan home. The cold in Glacier Pass didn't simply bite. It cleaved. Logan's breath came in sharp bursts as he pressed through thigh-deep snow, his boots crunching a rhythm beneath the dense canopy of pine. The trees stood tall and skeletal limbs drooping under blankets of frost, casting long, mournful shadows across the frozen path. Shadow trotted just ahead, his black coat streaked with snow, leaving a determined trail of paw prints behind. He didn't look back. He didn't slow. Logan had learned not to question him. They were 5 miles into the wilderness. The terrain had grown more brutal by the hour, inclined steeper, the wind more erratic. But the GPS signal still pulsed steady on his handheld. The destination was somewhere close, somewhere real. Logan wiped his face with a gloved hand and studied the screen. The coordinates hadn't shifted, but something in the air had. It was thicker here. Not just colder, but heavier, as though the trees themselves knew something had happened among them, something unspeakable. Shadow stopped suddenly, ears perked, head low, body frozen mid-stride. Logan raised his weapon instinctively. "What is it?" he whispered, more out of habit than expectation. The Malinois didn't move. Then, without warning, he darted left off the trail into the underbrush. Shadow, Logan hissed, stumbling after him. Branches clawed at his coat. Snow dumped from low-hanging limbs. The slope curved sharply downward. Logan skidded, cursed, caught himself on a rock. And then he saw it. The tower, an old ranger observation post, collapsed at the center, its roof sunken inward like a punctured lung. The metal scaffolding that had once propped it up jutted out in twisted angles, now overtaken by pine and snow. It hadn't been in use for years, maybe decades. And it wasn't on any recent maps. Shadow was at the base, circling slowly, sniffing. His nose led him to a cluster of stones beneath a dead spruce tree, arranged too neatly for nature's hand. Logan caught up, boots sinking into fresh powder. Shadow stopped, looked at him, and then with his front paw began to dig. What emerged wasn't surprising, but it still gutted Logan clean. A child's shoe. Small, faded pink, Velcro strap broken. Logan knelt, heart thundering. Shadow continued to dig, frantic now. Then came the smell. Rot. Faint but present. Logan's stomach turned. He pulled his scarf over his face and brushed the snow aside with trembling hands. The body was small, no more than 7 or 8. Face sunken, frozen into a quiet expression that somehow still spoke of terror. The child had been wrapped loosely in plastic, not even fully covered. Whoever had buried them hadn't cared to hide it well. Logan's hand shook as he pulled a corner of the plastic back. Male. Thin. dirty blonde hair matted with blood and ice. And beside the body, tucked into a small Ziploc bag, was a folded piece of paper. Logan slid it out, unfolded it. "We've only just begun." The words were scrawled in red ink. Jagged, uneven, like written by a shaking hand or someone who enjoyed the mess. Logan stared at the note, blood pounding in his ears. They were sending a message. This wasn't just murder. It was ritual. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat, gently recovered the body, and whispered a quiet apology to the lifeless boy. Then he turned to Shadow, who was now sniffing something just beneath the surface, a few feet away. The dog whined softly, began digging again. "What now?" Logan muttered. Shadow's paws uncovered a second item, something hard metallic but small. Logan leaned down and brushed away the snow. A digital voice recorder, half cracked. He held it up to the light. A flicker of power blinked red. Still functional. He pressed play. Static, wind, muffled crying. Then, "Please, please, no more." A child's voice, barely audible, trembling. Then another voice. "You're not done until I say so." Logan's breath caught. The voice was male, older, gruff, American. Then came a scuffle, the sound of a door slamming, and silence. Until, "Dad," one word. But it didn't just cut, it detonated. Logan dropped to his knees, eyes wide. That voice, that whisper. It was him, Ben. The last time he'd heard that voice was on a video message the night before the Medellin up. The boy had been excited, laughing into the camera, holding up a Lego plane he'd built. But this voice... This was the voice of a child who had seen things no child should. A voice stripped raw. Logan's hands trembled. He gripped the recorder tighter. His vision blurred. It was him, no doubt. Ben was alive, somewhere, and he'd been close enough for this device to be left behind, which meant someone wanted him to hear it. Logan staggered backward, planting himself on a fallen log. He stared up into the sky, blank gray, indifferent. The wind had died again, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He wanted to scream, to rip apart the trees and snow and earth until he found him, but he didn't. Instead, he looked down at Shadow. The dog sat a few feet away, watching him silently. Snow clung to his fur. His chest rose and fell slow. But his eyes, those eyes were molten steel, unwavering. They locked gazes, and Shadow lifted his head. No bark, no movement, just resolve. Logan exhaled sharply. "I know," he said quietly. "He's still out there." He stood, pocketed the recorder, folded the paper with shaking fingers, and tucked it into the inner lining of his coat. They'd only just begun. Fine. So had he. The GPS buzzed again. The signal pulsed. Logan glanced down. It had shifted, slightly. A new set of coordinates, perhaps triggered by his proximity to this site. They were being led, each breadcrumb deliberate, each horror placed like bait. Logan didn't care. He welcomed it. Let them show him their maze. He'd burn it down, all of it. He turned back toward the tree line. The storm had picked up again, soft flurries cascading down, like ash. Shadow moved first, weaving between snow-draped branches, nose low, pace steady. And Logan followed with fire under his ribs. Because now it wasn't just a mission. It was a resurrection, of purpose, of fury, of a father's war. And he wasn't walking into their trap blind. He had Shadow. And Shadow remembered everything. The sun never really rose in this part of the range, not during winter. Not with clouds that thick. The sky above Logan Harris was a sheet of smudged slate, refusing to bleed light. But he didn't need the sun. He was following a trail of ghosts. The forest had begun to thin an hour ago, and with it came signs of man-made decay. Faded tracks, barely visible beneath the snow. Concrete slabs half swallowed by roots. Twisted chain-link fencing, rusted and leaning like old skeletons. And then the road, or what had once been a road. A winding ribbon of blacktop, now cracked and overgrown, leading to a compound buried beneath trees. The concrete walls loomed behind a tangle of brush ivy and weather-stained camouflage netting. The sign at the gate was long gone. But Logan didn't need it. He knew exactly where he was. Omega-6. It had once been classified as a forward operations camp for counterinsurgency operations. In truth, it had been a cold lab. A think tank for surgical warfare. Logan had spent 6 years within those walls, training planning fighting beside men who were legends on paper and phantoms in real life. Men like Derek Stone. He walked through the skeletal remains of the checkpoint. The camera mounts were still there, lensless now. Beyond them, the inner yard was buried under snow weeds breaking through the concrete. Shadow moved beside him in silence, stopping only to sniff a faint scent near a broken pallet. The dog's muscles were tense, coiled, alert but not afraid. But not. He remembered this place too. The front door was sealed with a rusted lock long since dead. Logan reached for the keypad out of instinct, surprised to find it still intact. He punched in the old master code. The light blinked green. Click! Still afraid to change the locks, huh? Derek, Logan muttered. Inside, the air was stale, cold. The hallway smelled of mold and copper. He passed through corridors that once bustled with purpose. Now they were silent, hollow peeling. The mess hall door hung crooked. The med bay was stripped of all equipment. Only the scars on the walls, bullet marks, dried chemical burns, and hasty patchwork remained to speak of what had once happened here. But Logan wasn't here for nostalgia. He turned left down the lower corridor toward the records vault. It had been one of the few places in Omega-6 with no direct network link. Data was stored offline, encrypted, locked in rotating cold storage. Logan stopped outside the door, entered another code. The steel door groaned open. The room beyond was lined floor to ceiling with gray filing cabinets, all stamped with the same insignia, the Omega symbol slashed by a diagonal line, and dust. Dust on everything, except Shadow's paw tapped to the floor sharply. He growled low, deliberate, then stepped into the vault, sniffing along the bottom drawers. He stopped, scratched once at the third cabinet from the left. Then again, Logan followed. He squatted beside the drawer. The label had faded with time, but he could still make out a hand-scrawled name. Project Vigilance Phase Red. He yanked it open. Files slid back with a crackling hiss. Stacks of folders all marked with 3-letter designations and 6-digit IDs. Some had photos attached by rusted paper clips. Children. Most of them couldn't have been older than 10. Beneath the pictures, biodata blood types, DNA chains, neural scan reports, organ compatibility matrices. Then the notes, psyche vals, cognitive benchmarks, obedience index scores. God, Logan breathed. He flipped faster now, eyes scanning names, so many names, dozens, hundreds. And then he stopped. Shadow let out a soft whimper. Logan stared at the name on the tab. Harris Benjamin, 17-019B. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a photo of Ben, but not the one he remembered. This boy was slightly older, thinner. His expression was blank, like someone had drained the light from him. His hair had been cropped to regulation. Eyes wide, but empty. The profile listed his age 11, height 4'8", status active. Assignment Omega Cell, indoctrination complete. He dropped to one knee. Ben had been in the system. In this system. Not killed, not lost. Recruited, broken, reprogrammed. His boy. And someone had let it happen. Made it happen. Derek, Logan growled. He turned the page. At the bottom was a clearance tag, authorized by Stone D. That was the snap. The click in his chest. It all locked into place. Logan rose slowly. Once upon a time, Derek Stone had been his commanding officer. His partner. A man who saved his life more times than he could count. They'd bled together. Built Omega-6 together. And died together. Or so Logan had believed. The ambush in Medellin had been chaos. Explosives, gunfire, radio silence. The evac had arrived too late. Logan had barely made it out alive. Derek's body had never been recovered. Until now, Logan had thought that was just war. Now he knew better. Derek hadn't died. He'd gone underground. And he'd taken everything they'd built and twisted it. Logan stepped back, fingers curling into fists. I trusted you, he said under his breath. Shadow let out a low growl ears back. Logan turned. Something had shifted in the hallway outside. He crossed the vault quietly, pistol drawn. Listened. Footsteps. No. A thud. Then static. His comm receiver, long dead, buzzed faintly at his belt. He hadn't used it since the days of deep field work. It flickered again. Then came a voice. Distorted. Filtered through static. Logan. He froze. I wondered when you'd find me. Derek's voice. Older but unmistakable. Logan reached for the receiver, rage simmering under the surface. Where is he? You're asking the wrong question, Derek said. You should be asking what's left of him. Logan gritted his teeth. I swear to God. You don't believe in God anymore, remember? You lost that when you lost them. Logan's hand tightened around the grip of his Glock. You watched me bury an empty coffin because you needed to believe it was over. That you weren't responsible. Logan stared into the shadows of the corridor. I'll find you. You already did. The signal cut. Logan hurled the receiver against the wall, shattering it. Silence. Then Shadow stepped beside him, and at his feet something metallic clinked across the ground. A coin. No, an ID tag. Military. Bent. Burned around the edges. He picked it up. Stone D, Athen 01. Logan turned it over. Etched into the back, Invictus. Unconquered. His old unit motto. He stared at the tag. The sound of Derek's voice still buzzing behind his eyes. He wasn't just chasing a ghost now. He was hunting the man who'd orchestrated the greatest betrayal of his life. And it wasn't just about Ben anymore. It was about every child in those files. Every life rewritten by the program they had sworn to dismantle. Shadow growled again. Logan tucked the tag into his pocket. Turned toward the hallway. This ends with me, he said. And together, they vanished into the dark. The wind roared through the canyon like a voice trying to scream through centuries of stone. It wasn't the same storm that had chased them through Glacier Pass. This one was older, quieter, and cruel in different ways. The trail had long since vanished beneath the snow. The forest thinned into jagged rock, then fell away into narrow ravines cut into the mountain's edge, cold and ancient as bone. Logan crouched beside a boulder, studying the last ping from the GPS. The signal had stopped moving. Static pulses. Steady. Whatever was broadcasting it hadn't moved in hours, maybe days. That meant one of two things. It was buried, or it was watching. He glanced to Shadow, who had paused just ahead, ears twitching, nose flaring. His tail stood still like a black flag nailed to the wind. There, Logan asked. Shadow didn't look back. He crept forward, paw after paw, along a razor-thin ledge that curved into the side of the cliff. Logan followed his shoulder-grazing stone as he moved sideways through a narrow slit in the mountain. The drop beside them fell away into a sheer nothing, no safety net, no sound below. Just endless white swallowing the abyss. Then they reached it. The door. It didn't look like a door at first, just another slab of iron embedded in the rock wall. But then Logan saw the pattern of bolts, the faint outline of a biometric panel long dead. A bunker, buried in the stone like a secret no one wanted to remember. Logan ran his hand across the steel. Cold, dull, scorched along one side from what looked like a decades-old explosion. The keypad beside it blinked weakly, wired to a power cell, clearly past its prime. Let's hope the override still works, Logan murmured. He pulled a small black device from his pack, a field decryptor designed to spoof access codes, plugged it into the panel. The screen flashed. Lines of code scrambled. Access denied. Access denied. Then, access granted. With a hiss of age and pressure, the steel door released. The hinges groaned. Logan raised his weapon as the darkness opened before them. He stepped inside. The first thing that hit him was the smell stale air and iron. Dust, mold, blood. Shadow followed behind him, every muscle tense. They moved down a corridor lined with rusted lights that flickered overhead, like they were too tired to stay awake. A sound echoed down the hall. Boots! Close. Too close. Logan ducked into a shadowed alcove. Two guards rounded the corner, black tactical gear assault rifles slung low. No insignia. Private. Off books. One of them paused. The other spoke in clipped Russian-accented English. Sweep finished. Bunker clear. Command wants drone uplinks operational by 0400. Then, a sound behind them. A whisper of breath. Shadow. He lunged. The first guard went down hard. Shadow's teeth clamped into the man's forearm before he could raise his rifle. The second turned. Logan fired once. The shot echoed through the metal chamber. The man dropped. Silence. Shadow released the first man, now unconscious, arm bleeding, twitching against the wall. Still got it, Logan muttered. He dragged both bodies into a utility closet, took one of their ID tags, and slung the man's access badge around his own neck. Then deeper, they passed a shattered surveillance station screens, dead or looping security feeds from corridors long collapsed. Then the map room. It was massive. The walls covered in printed schematics, yellowing diagrams of tunnel systems dug into the mountain's belly. Some went back to the Cold War, others had been updated recently. Fresh ink printed on heat-resistant polymer. One map caught Logan's eye. Sector Echo, Child Training Containment Grid. Beneath it, notes: max occupancy 32, status active, internal rotation. He traced his fingers over the pathways on the wall. One tunnel led from the bunker's main level down into the lower caverns. Through heat-insulated shafts, reinforced gates, and command checkpoints. Shadow growled. Logan turned. Across the room, a wall of murals, crudely drawn in charcoal and chalk. Not military, not artistic. Children's drawings, jagged stick figures. Dogs, helicopters. Some of the figures had names written above them in shaky reversed lettering. Others were crossed out. Next to the largest set of drawings was a vertical row of Mark's tally lines. Dozens, then a slash. Dozens more, each line the same height. Like someone had kept count. Like a prisoner would. Shadow whimpered. Logan stepped closer. There was something beneath the drawing, scratched so faintly into the wall, it was nearly invisible. A name. Ben. His hand froze over the letters. It wasn't coincidence. This was where they had been. Where they'd been kept. Shadow suddenly stiffened. He moved fast, head low, nose pressed to the concrete near the edge of the mural. Then he stopped, let out a sound halfway between a growl and a cry. Logan rushed to him. What is it? The dog pressed his snout against a dark stain in the floor, barely visible, but fresh. Not oil, not rust. Logan knelt, pulled a test strip from his belt, pressed it to the floor. The strip turned crimson. Blood. Still warm. Shadow licked the air, then turned suddenly, darting down the corridor like a bolt. Shadow. Logan followed. He chased the dog through twisting halls, past abandoned mess areas and silent drone bays, until they reached a side shaft, narrow steep leading downward into blackness. The air changed. Colder, wetter, and a smell he knew too well. Fear. Shadow stopped near the top of the descent. Waited. Logan stepped beside him. They looked down together. Somewhere below, the mountain exhaled, and the war Logan thought he'd lost 4 years ago had just opened its eyes again. The corridor narrowed the farther they descended the concrete walls, bleeding moisture and old secrets. The smell of metal and sweat intensified with every step until it clung to Logan's throat like a warning. The temperature dropped. Lights above flickered dimly, some broken, others pulsing like the heart of something trying to die. Shadow moved cautiously ahead, tail down, nose twitching. He'd stopped growling. Now he was silent, tense. A predator that knew it was walking into the territory of something worse than wolves. They reached a reinforced steel door. Card scanner, biometric plate. It wasn't locked. Logan exchanged a glance with Shadow, then pushed the door open. What lay beyond was not a room. It was a world. A cavernous space had been carved into the rock, a military training arena buried beneath the mountain, humming with fluorescent lights and machines. The center was marked by a large circular zone lined with chalk and faded paint combat floor. To the left, modular shooting ranges with paper silhouettes hanging from retractable wires. Human-shaped. Some had childlike scribbles across the torsos, faces drawn in crayon over targets. To the right, a table of disassembled firearms, each one labeled in English, Russian, and Mandarin. Assault rifles, pistols, even parts of long-range drone controllers. Above a glass observation deck, dark now, but lined with what looked like two-way mirrors and microphone booms. And in the back, near a corner that smelled of urine and bleach bunk beds, dozens of them, child-sized, bare mattresses, stains, chains. Logan's jaw locked. No, he muttered, stepping forward. No. He had known. Of course he had known. The files, the blood, the map. But this was built for children. Not just to hold them, but to recreate them. Shadow moved toward the far wall, ears perked, nose flaring. He stopped at a corner and growled. Low, steady. Logan followed. And there, huddled behind a crate of broken drone parts, was a girl, no older than 10, filthy, hair tangled, dressed in a gray utility suit too big for her frame. Her hands clutched a jagged piece of metal like a knife. Logan froze. He lowered his weapon. Crouched low. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're not here to hurt you." The girl didn't speak, but Shadow stepped forward slowly, carefully, and sat. The girl looked at him, then at Logan. "Lyra," she said finally. Her voice barely carried. "My name's Lyra." "Okay, Lyra." Logan's voice cracked. "I'm Logan. This is Shadow." The girl nodded once. Her eyes were bright, too bright. Not the kind of brightness born of innocence, but the kind that comes from trauma, sharpened into survival. She lowered the makeshift blade. "How long have you been here?" Logan asked. She shrugged. "Since the fire." "What fire?" She didn't answer. Logan crouched lower, glanced toward the walls lined with surveillance cameras. He doubted any of them were still active. But he knew better than to assume. "We're trying to find someone," he said gently. "A boy. His name is Ben. Do you know that name?" Something shifted in her face. A flicker of something, a tremor through the mask she wore so well. "Ben," she repeated. "Yes." Logan's breath caught. "Where is he?" "They call him 17, she whispered. "Subject 17. Logan felt the world tilt beneath him. "He's..." She trailed off. "He's the best. He never misses. Not once." Shadow growled softly. Logan didn't move. "He taught me how to move through the dark without being seen." Lyra went on. "How to breathe slower when the sirens come. How to hide behind your own heartbeat." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "But they did something to him. To his memory. One day he just stopped remembering us. Stopped calling himself Ben." Logan couldn't breathe. "He doesn't know who I am anymore," Lyra whispered. "He just waits for the orders." A screen across the room crackled to life. All three turned. A video feed. Grainy, static-lined, but active. It showed the training ring. A child stood in the center. Tall for his age, muscular, eyes forward, shoulders squared. "Ben?" Logan dropped to his knees. The video had no sound, but the commands were clear. Ben reacted with precision. On cue. Picked up an unloaded rifle, assembled it in 17 seconds, disassembled it again, then repeated the motion with a pistol. Next clip, hand-to-hand combat against two older teenagers. Ben neutralized both in under 12 seconds. Final clip, Ben approached a bound figure, hooded, kneeling. He raised a gun, blank round, pulled the trigger without blinking. Logan turned away. Shadow pressed against him. Lyra's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "He's still in there. I know he is. But they buried him deep." Logan stared into nothing. Ben had been alive. Ben had become a machine. His son, his boy who once screamed in joy over snowball fights, who asked why the stars blinked, who cried when a bird hit their window. Now he was Subject 17, and Logan had been too late. Shadow licked Logan's trembling hand. Logan didn't look at him, but he squeezed the fur between his fingers, as if anchoring himself to the only pure thing left in this hellhole. "I'm going to find him," Logan whispered. "No matter what they did to him. No matter what I have to burn to the ground. Lyra looked at him, eyes shining with something fragile. Hope. He'll remember you, she said. He has to. Logan rose slowly, his hands clenched, his mind burning. And somewhere behind the walls, somewhere in the dark, Ben Harris waited. Programmed, weaponized, forgotten, but not for long. The hallway leading to the surveillance control room was silent, but not empty. Every camera had long since gone dark. Most of the monitors lining the corridor had gone cold, their screens blank or cracked, their glass coated in dust and static. But the feeling Logan felt it like pressure behind the eyes was alive, watching, waiting. He moved with his back to the wall, each step careful measured. Shadow followed at his side, tail low, breathing steady, his steps whispering against the tile. They reached the door. A rusted panel blinked red, biometric locked. Logan knelt, unscrewed the faceplate, and shorted the panel manually with 2 wires stripped from his kit. Sparks snapped. Then, hiss, the door slid open. Inside was darkness, thick choking. Then one by one screens flickered to life. 12, 2 dozen. Some looping grainy footage, others displaying real-time feeds from within the facility's remaining operational sectors. And in the center, a control console untouched. Logan crossed the room, eyes scanning for anything that could point him toward Ben's location. Shadow sniffed near a crate in the corner, tense, unmoving. Then a screen flashed. Feed Nezor 7. Camera angle, upper corner of the very hallway they'd just walked through. The screen showed Logan and Shadow moving in real time. They were being watched. Logan stepped back instinctively, hand on his weapon. But then the feed shifted. Zoomed. Another feed loaded next to it, feed note 08. This time it showed the interior of the training room they'd just left. Lyra's empty bunk. The chalk marks on the walls. Then a third feed appeared, feed note 4. A new figure, in a plain gray uniform, standing in a hallway. Posture stiff, eyes forward. His face bathed in sterile overhead light. Ben. Logan stopped breathing. His son stood silent, expression unreadable, watching the screens. And on one of those screens, Logan realized was a live feed of him. Ben was watching him. Jesus, Logan whispered. A low click echoed behind the monitors. One of the large center screens blinked black, then returned, this time not with security footage, but a face. Derek Stone. His hair was shorter now, grayer. His face thinner, tighter. But the smirk, that half-condescending sneer, was unmistakable. Hello, Logan. Logan stepped forward, jaw clenched. You son of a bitch. Still dramatic, Derek said, folding his hands in front of him like he was giving a TED talk. Still emotional. Always your flaw. You took my son. I saved your son, Derek countered. From a weak world that chews boys into dust and calls it normal. Logan's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. Where is he? Derek smiled wider. He's watching you right now. That's what you really want to know, isn't it? Not where, but how. A new feed popped into the top right monitor. Ben again, standing at attention in a stark white room. Behind a one-way mirror, and on his side of the glass, Logan. This room, this very control room. Ben was here, watching him. Derek's voice returned colder now. He doesn't remember you. Doesn't remember snow days or bedtime stories, or the camping trip where he broke his wrist falling out of the canoe. You know why. Logan didn't speak. Derek leaned closer to the camera. Because I took it all. And gave him something better. You brainwashed a child, Logan growled. I freed him, Derek said, fury finally slipping through the polish. I gave him purpose. He's a soldier now. The best I've ever built. Logan stared into the screen. You want me to say you won, that you broke him, that you built something stronger than a father's love? Derek blinked slowly. No, Logan. I want you to understand. Because this time you get to choose. The lights flickered. A new feed appeared. The hallway. Footsteps. Heavy, measured. Then the door to the control room exploded inward. Smoke, dust, splinters. Logan was thrown back against the wall. Shadow barked, sharp, vicious, immediately taking a defensive stance. Through the haze, a figure stepped into the room. Ben. He was taller now, thinner, dressed in black tactical gear. His face was blank, expressionless, eyes lifeless. He held a sidearm. Standard issue, steady, finger on the trigger. Ben. Logan's voice cracked. Ben didn't blink. He raised the gun. Shadow stepped between them, growling, teeth bared. Ben, it's me, Logan said, rising slowly, hands open. It's Dad. The gun didn't move. Derek's voice echoed from the speakers again. Say the word and he'll put you down clean. Logan stared at his son, his heart breaking into pieces smaller than sound. Ben, he whispered. You used to ask why wolves howled at night. Do you remember? Nothing. You used to say it was because they missed the moon. Because it never stayed. Ben's jaw twitched, a flicker, but the gun remained pointed. Your mother used to sing to you, Logan said, stepping forward. That stupid song about the train that couldn't stop. Remember, you used to beg for it before bed. Ben flinched, almost imperceptibly. Shadow held his ground, his body trembling, prepared to launch. Then, Ben blinked. Something shifted in his face. His grip on the gun loosened just a fraction. Shadow saw it. He looked back at Logan. And Logan saw it too. There was still something left. But Derek's voice cut in again, colder than before. 17, he barked. Ben's body stiffened. Back straightened. Execute. Ben raised the gun, and Shadow leapt. The dog collided with Ben's chest, throwing the aim wide as the gun fired. The shot ricocheted off the console. Logan dove forward, tackling them both as they hit the ground hard. The gun skidded across the floor. Ben rolled, instinct kicking in, his training surging. He landed 2 sharp blows to Shadow's ribs, but the dog didn't back down. He snarled, teeth inches from Ben's face, but didn't bite. Logan pulled Ben back, slamming him against the wall. Ben gasped, for air, for clarity, and for the first time, looked directly into Logan's eyes. "Dad?" he rasped. Just one word, enough to break the world. Logan didn't speak. Didn't need to. He grabbed his son, pulled him into his arms. Ben didn't fight. Didn't move, only trembled. And Shadow, blood at the corner of his mouth, lay down beside them, eyes never leaving the door. Because Derek wasn't done. Not yet, but neither were they. The room stood suspended in a silence that was anything but empty. It vibrated with things unsaid, unfinished, unbearable. Ben stood at the far end, his sidearm lowered, but not dropped, his breathing quick and shallow. His face was unreadable, still, too trained. But there was something in his eyes now. A fracture. A shimmer. Logan took a slow step forward, arms still spread. "Ben," he said softly, "it's me." The boy flinched again, as if the name itself scratched against something raw. He didn't speak. Behind them, one of the overhead speakers clicked on its sound, cracked and cold. Derek's voice slithered into the room. 17, he said, flat and sharp, "stand down or terminate." Ben stiffened. Logan kept his voice steady, low, personal, like talking to a wounded animal on the edge of bolt or surrender. "You remember the lake house," Logan said. "Pine Ridge." Ben didn't move. "We used to go every summer. Your mom would bring those sugar-drenched cereals she said were only for vacation. You made a fleet of paper boats one year. Wouldn't let me toss a single one." Ben blinked, his eyes flickering. Logan's voice broke with the memory. "You cried when one sank. Said it was your Navy, and every boat had a name. I asked which one was your favorite." He took another step. "And you said, 'Commander Ben on patrol.'" Ben staggered back half a step. The gun trembled in his hand. Then came the final blow. Logan said, louder now, clear, direct, undeniable. "Ben Twinzait in Ho Pine." 3 things happened at once. Ben froze. The grip on his gun loosened. And Derek's voice returned sharp like a blade. "No sung." Ben's body jerked. The programming took hold. His arm raised, the weapon aimed at Logan's chest. But Shadow had already moved. A black blur, a snarl ripped through the room as the dog launched himself across the space. In one bound, he struck Logan square in the ribs, shoving him sideways off balance. The shot rang out, a single flat crack of death. It echoed forever. Shadow hit the ground, hard legs, crumpling beneath him. Blood bloomed dark across his side. "No!" Logan shouted, catching himself against the console. Ben stood frozen, the pistol shaking now. His breath came in heaves, his eyes wide, wild, confused. Shadow let out a low, broken whimper. Logan crawled toward him, hands fumbling to press against the wound. It was deep. Too deep. Blood spilled across the cold floor, staining Shadow's dark coat crimson. "Hold on," Logan whispered, voice shattered. "Hold on, buddy." Shadow looked at him, not with fear, with peace, then turned his gaze to Ben. The boy was shaking, and then he dropped the gun. It clattered across the floor and spun against the far wall. Ben dropped to his knees. "Dad." The word was raw, broken, as if dug out from beneath years of concrete and silence. Logan turned, disbelief breaking into sobs. Ben crawled forward, eyes never leaving the dying dog beside them. Shadow's breathing hitched. A wet gasp. His head sagged into Logan's palm. Ben reached out, laid his hand gently on the dog's side. Tears fell freely. "He saved you," Ben said. "I tried to stop, but I couldn't. I wanted to, but I—" "It's okay," Logan whispered, pulling his son into his arms. "You're here now. That's what matters." Ben clung to him like the boy he used to be, and then his eyes lifted. One of the monitors still glowed. Derek stared back at them, expression unreadable. Ben stepped forward slowly, his jaw tight. His hands still trembling, but his voice steady now, sharpened by memory and something more primal. "Resolve. Chao chai ông đã trở về." The sentence hit the air like a verdict. On the monitor, Derek's face didn't change. But something behind his eyes cracked. Logan pulled Shadow closer, feeling the dog's chest slow. "I'm sorry," he said through gritted teeth, voice breaking. "You brought him back. And you gave everything to do it." Shadow's eyes closed. Not from pain, from peace. His job was done. He had led them through the fire. And now, he could finally rest. The light in the room dimmed slightly as the emergency power cycle stuttered. Ben stood still, his hands now fists. His voice no longer the voice of Subject 17, nor the lost child taken from the lake, was full of fire. "We're going to find the rest of them," he said. "And then we burn it all down." Logan looked up, and for the first time in 4 years, he saw his son. The first tremor hit like a distant growl beneath their feet. Then came the sirens, shrill, rising, mechanical, like the mountain itself had begun to scream. Logan spun toward the monitors. A red warning flashed across every screen in the control room. Protocol Sigma. System self-termination. T1 080 seconds. Derek's last card. "Shit," Logan hissed. "He's blowing it all." Smoke began to creep through the ceiling vents. The floor vibrated harder now. Cracks split along the concrete walls, dust showering down. Ben stood frozen for half a second. Then instinct kicked in. He turned, grabbed Lyra by the wrist. "This way," he shouted, but Logan didn't move yet. He looked down. Shadow lay motionless on the cold floor, still bleeding chest rising with small, ragged breaths. His eyes had stayed closed, but he wasn't gone, not yet. And Logan wasn't leaving him behind. He dropped to one knee, slid his arms beneath the dog's frame. "You're not dying in this place," he whispered. "Not here." He lifted him gently, wincing at the weight, the warmth of blood seeping into his jacket. Shadow didn't stir, but he didn't fight it either. Just breathed. One more time. They ran. Ben led through the hallway, guiding Lyra with one hand flashlight with the other. Logan followed, boots slamming against trembling steel as emergency lights flickered and failed. Overhead, another explosion roared concrete above their heads, shuddered as a section of the ceiling collapsed behind them. Flames licked through the cracks. They were almost at the back entrance, the old engineering tunnel that Lyra had once tried to escape through, but had found sealed. Now it stood open, blown inward. Logan's heart stopped for a breath. Then he saw them. 6 shadows cutting through the smoke and snow. Dark gear. No insignia, rifles at the ready, sweeping both sides of the corridor like they'd never stopped moving since the last war ended. The lead stepped forward. Broad shoulders, visor, lifted face, grizzled, but unmistakable. "Logan," the man said, voice like gravel soaked in whiskey. "Heard you were stirring ghosts." Logan exhaled. "Rook," he said, the name landing like an anchor. Jackson Rook, former tactical lead of Ghostfire, the unofficial recon and extraction unit that had saved Logan's life more times than he could count. Disbanded. Erased. And now here. "How the hell did you find us?" Logan asked. "We never stopped watching," Rook said, and Shadow knew the signal. He looked down at the dog in Logan's arms, battered, bleeding, barely breathing. Looks like he remembered too much. "Yeah," Logan said quietly. He always did. "Tunnel's compromised in 20 minutes, Rook snapped. "We've got a chopper inbound in 8. We make it or we don't. No in between." The rest of Ghostfire fell into formation, silent, efficient. One of them, a younger woman with braids and a sniper's stillness, stepped forward holding a med evac stretcher. "For the dog," she said, eyes meeting Logan's. He hesitated. Then laid Shadow onto the canvas gently. The dog's paw twitched. Then he lifted his head, barely, looked at Logan, at Ben. Then licked Logan's hand, once weak but deliberate. Logan bit back everything. Ben reached out, brushing Shadow's side. "He saved both of us," the boy said. "And he's going to live," Logan answered, voice of promise. Rook nodded to his team. "Move." The tunnel ahead twisted and narrowed, but it was clear. For now, until the world behind them caught up. The facility began to collapse in earnest. Now secondary charges set along load-bearing corridors, detonating in sequence. Walls fell. Lights died. An eighth on everything it had hidden and trained erased was burning. They moved fast. Ben kept pace beside Logan, eyes scanning constantly. Lyra, breathing hard, didn't let go of his hand. When they emerged from the tunnel mouth into the freezing open air, the storm outside greeted them like a second enemy. Whiteout, wind, ice, zero visibility. But above it all, a thumping sound. "Blades," Rook pointed. "There's our ride." The Black Hawk dipped from the clouds, searchlights stabbing through the blizzard. But so did the gunfire. From the tree-line, figures opened fire, Derek's last line of defense. Mercenaries. Desperate men paid with secrets and silence. Rook's team returned fire, instantly, disciplined and devastating. Logan dropped low behind a snowbank, passed Shadow's stretcher off to the medic, and joined the fight, covering the right flank with precise shots. Ben knelt beside him, picked up a fallen guard's weapon. Logan hesitated, but then Ben looked at him, eyes clear, steady, full of fire. "I remember enough," he said. "I know who the bad guys are." "Then stay low," Logan replied. Together, father and son fought back shoulder to shoulder. Smoke from the mountain mouth poured upward, mixing with snow into a storm of fire and ash. Trees ignited. The ground shook. And over it all, the Blackhawk's skids touched down. "Go, Rook," shouted. The last members of Ghostfire formed a perimeter as Logan carried Shadow up the ramp. Ben pushed Lyra in ahead of him. Inside, the heat of the engine roared around them. Shadow was laid gently onto the floor of the cabin. The medic immediately began to work oxygen mask pressure dressing. Shadow's eyes cracked open just once. He saw Logan, saw Ben, and rested. Logan crouched beside him, cradling the dog's head, letting him hear the only words that mattered. You brought us home. The ramp closed. The helicopter lifted. And below them, the mountain that had held every secret, every lie, every stolen child finally collapsed in on itself. A firestorm buried in snow. Ethan was dead. But Shadow lived. So did Ben. And now, so did Logan. The snow had stopped falling, but the world hadn't yet caught its breath. The mountain behind them was now nothing more than a scar smoke still rose in lazy plumes from its collapsed core. A grave for ghosts, secrets, and the children who never made it out. But above it all, the sky had cleared soft blue, cracking through what had been storm for so long. 3 days later, Logan Harris stood in a room filled with screens. Not control monitors, not surveillance feeds. Real ones, media displays, news broadcasts, incoming email threads, video clips rapidly spliced, time-stamped, watermarked for evidence. All feeding into a central workstation that buzzed with a relentless current. The woman behind the keyboard was moving like lightning, fingertips flying. Her name was Ellie Tanner, investigative journalist, once blacklisted for trying to expose a military-funded orphanage cover-up. Now she was the only person Logan trusted to bring truth to daylight. She slapped a USB drive onto the desk between them. "It's all here," she said. "Every file you pulled from Athon's data core. Every video, every financial transfer, every name." Logan leaned over, scanning a list that seemed to scroll endlessly. Children ages, code names, locations, DNA markers. And next to them, sponsors. Corporate, government, private. Ellie's voice dropped. "You know what this is going to do?" Logan didn't blink. "Good." She studied him. "There's no going back from this." "There never was." Ellie nodded once, then stood and walked to the broadcasting rig they'd hastily set up in the basement of a news affiliate studio in New Mexico. Off the grid, secure. The room dimmed as the screen synced. She plugged in the drive. "Uploading now." In less than 2 minutes, it was everywhere. The first wave hit social media, grainy footage of child combat drills. Children being yelled at in multiple languages. Surgical tables. Drug logs. Derek's voice commanding from off-screen. "Subject 17, proceed." Then the spreadsheet. List of over 1,300 children, some dead, some missing, some still alive under different names. Then the money trail. Ethan's shell corporations, linked directly to offshore accounts, then back to high-ranking officials in 7 different countries. The world held its breath. Then the explosion began. Every news outlet, BBC, CNN, NHK, Al Jazeera, scrambled for a piece of it. Governments denied, then hesitated, then began to crack. Within 12 hours, Interpol issued a red notice for Derek Stone. Within 48, 3 national inquiries reopened cold cases into child disappearances once deemed unsolvable. By the 3rd day, Athon was a household name, not as a company, but as a cautionary symbol of what happens when power meets shadows and no one's watching. And yet somehow in the middle of it all, Logan stayed silent, until the world asked him to speak. He sat under the soft lights of a public television studio in Denver, nothing fancy. No suits. Just a man, a chair, and a camera that had been rolling for the past 10 minutes. Across from him, the host cleared her throat. "You've refused every request for an interview since the footage was released," she said. "Why now?" Logan didn't shift, his face unreadable. But his eyes carried every mile, every name, every scream that still echoed from inside those walls. "Because I want people to understand," he said, voice low, but unwavering. "Understand what?" He looked directly into the lens. "That this didn't happen in a vacuum. Monsters like Derek don't build empires in the dark. They build them under the noses of people too distracted, too tired, or too afraid to believe something this horrific could be real." The interviewer paused. And what stopped it? What broke through? Logan leaned forward. It wasn't the government. It wasn't a task force. It wasn't some miracle. He took a deep breath. It was a dog. Silence. He continued, voice thick. A dog who never forgot his mission. Who crawled through snow, blood, and fire to bring me the truth. Who stood between me and my son when that choice could have meant death. Who remembered who we were when the rest of the world forgot. His hands tightened in his lap. "You want to know what saved us?" he asked. "It wasn't luck. It wasn't fate. It wasn't some divine hand." A pause. "It was the love of a creature who never stopped believing in the mission we shared." He exhaled. "That's not a miracle." A faint smile. "That's loyalty." The host's voice was barely above a whisper. "How is Shadow?" Logan glanced off camera. There, just out of frame, curled on a padded mat beside a medical IV, lay the Malinois. Older, quieter, scarred, but alive. Ben sat beside him, one hand resting on Shadow's chest, rising and falling in rhythm with every breath. Logan returned his gaze to the lens. "He saved us. Now it's our turn to protect the rest." The camera cut to black. But the world had already woken up. Winter didn't end all at once. It faded. Snow still blanketed the Wyoming mountains, but it no longer looked like ash. It looked clean. bright. Like the sky had finally remembered how to breathe, and the earth was learning to forgive itself. The facility was gone now, a scorched void sealed off by federal tape and guarded memory. But farther north, in a secluded patch of pine not marked on any official map, something new was rising. The sign was simple, carved by hand and bolted to stone. Hollow Light Sanctuary. Beneath it, a smaller plaque. For those who carried the darkness, so that others wouldn't have to. The ground stretched wide, blanketed in fresh snow and laughter. Not the rehearsed kind. Not the kind ordered or trained. The kind that burst out unexpectedly when children forgot the world had once tried to break them. And above it all, the faint beat of paws on snow. Shadow walked slowly now, rear right leg stiff from nerve damage, a soft brace fitted to his hip. The surgery had taken 12 hours, the recovery months. But he lived. And more importantly, he was still Shadow. Every morning he patrolled the perimeter with Logan. Every evening he lay near the fire, his head resting on the knee of a child who needed it most that day. And every Sunday the local paper ran a photo, Shadow of Hope, they called it. The story had spread farther than Logan ever intended. People didn't want heroes anymore, they wanted witnesses. They wanted something that had looked death in the face and still limped forward. Shadow was all of that. He didn't bark much now. He didn't need to. Ben sat cross-legged on the porch. A model plane balanced between his fingers, 3 younger boys gathered around him. Their eyes tracked every motion, measuring, copying, learning. "See," Ben said softly. "If you glue the fuselage too soon, the wings will warp. You've got to trust the frame first. It's all about patience." The kids nodded solemnly, as if he were revealing the universe. Logan stood nearby, arms crossed, watching it all, like someone trying to convince himself this wasn't just a dream. But it wasn't. It was the aftermath. He still woke some nights in a cold sweat, the scent of smoke and blood thick in his throat. He still kept a weapon under his pillow, though he never used it. He still carried the names of the children they hadn't reached. But now he also carried this. A sunrise. A moment. Ben laughing without checking if it was allowed. Lyra a short distance away, sitting on a flat stone with a sketch pad in her lap. She drew without looking up. Bold lines, chaotic colors, everything a child should have the freedom to create. Ellie visited every few weeks, sometimes to document, sometimes just to sit in silence and watch the fire crackle. Her exposé on Ethan had already won 3 journalism awards she hadn't bothered to collect. She didn't care. But she did care about this place, and the fact that it was real. Inside the main cabin, the walls were lined with maps, rescue routes, emergency shelters, missing persons boards. A team of volunteers, many former Ghost Fire operatives, worked full-time now training dogs, providing therapy for rescued children, building drones and tech to comb wilderness for new cases. It was a sanctuary, but it was also a response, a promise that they would never let it happen again. Logan sat beside Shadow one afternoon near the ridge. The dog rested his head on Logan's boot. Snow fell lightly. "You were right," Logan said quietly. "We were never done. We just forgot what we were fighting for." Shadow's ear twitched. Ben approached, holding one of the model planes. He handed it to Logan. "It flies," he said. "I named it Commander 2. Logan smiled. "What happened to Commander 1? Ben tilted his head. "He got promoted." Behind them, a new van pulled into the clearing. Another child stepping out, clutching a duffel bag, eyes hollow but hopeful. Shadow stirred. Ben turned to greet the kid, and Logan stood still for a long moment, watching the snow, the sun, the sky. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was real. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The jungle heat was unforgiving. It shimmered off the cracked pavement outside a rural airstrip in northern Colombia, where 2 black SUVs had just rolled to a stop near the rusted hangar. The soldiers surrounding them weren't local. They wore no insignia, just vests, masks, and silence. But their posture said everything. This wasn't a routine extradition. This was the conclusion of a manhunt, wrapped in whispers and denials, finally ending where the world had once learned to stop asking questions. From the rear of the second SUV, Derek Stone stepped down slowly. He was thinner than before, his beard thicker, his hair matted from the weeks in hiding. But his eyes, those eyes were still sharp, still cold, still staring through people rather than at them. He wore a plain white shirt and khaki prison pants, wrists, chained ankles, shackled. But there was no sign of defeat in his expression. He looked up at the sky like it owed him something. Then he smiled. The press release hit the internet the next day. Former defense contractor Derek Stone, wanted for international crimes against humanity, extradited to the U.S. on charges of human trafficking, genetic experimentation, and child weaponization. Below it, a blurry photograph of his arrest. And in the comments, people didn't cheer. They watched. Because even caged Derek Stone looked like he was still planning something. Back in Wyoming, the snow had finally begun to melt in patches. Spring came late here, but it came anyway. The yard outside Hollow Light Sanctuary was full that morning. Reporters, officials, families, veterans, volunteers. and the children scattered across benches, blankets, and shoulders. At the center of it all, a small podium with a Department of Homeland Security banner behind it. A man in a tailored suit adjusted the microphone. "We are gathered here, not for ceremony," he began, "but for recognition. Recognition of courage that went unseen, service that went unrecorded, and loyalty that surpassed all expectations." He cleared his throat. "There are many medals we give to heroes, but only one is given to those whose acts transcend even the value of their own lives." He turned slightly. "Shadow." The name echoed across the field. On the small platform beside the podium, Shadow lay curled beside Ben, his gray muzzled head resting on the boy's foot. His body had lost some weight, his eyes a little more clouded, but he was there. The man kneeled and gently placed a medal, a round silver emblem engraved with the words "Loyalty Beyond Death" onto the velvet cushion in front of Shadow. Shadow didn't move. He didn't need to. The applause didn't come immediately, but it came. Not loud, but real. Logan stood in the back, arms folded, sunglasses shielding eyes already red. Ellie leaned in from beside him. "You think he gets it?" she whispered. Logan didn't answer right away. Then, with a faint smile, "He never needed medals, just missions." Ben crouched and gently scratched behind Shadow's ears. The dog leaned into his hand, slow and deliberate. For a long while, that was all that mattered. It wasn't until that night that the second phone call came. Encrypted, untraceable. Only 3 people in Logan's life still had that channel code, but this wasn't any of them. He answered it anyway. A voice on the other end, female, tired, calm, spoke one sentence. "We have a match." Logan sat up slowly. "A match to what?" "DNA," the woman said. "Ethan's genetic sequencing library. One of the recovered data cores was decrypted by your journalist. There's a memory scan file linked to subject 02F. Logan's pulse surged. He already knew the number. "Emily." Silence. Then the voice again, slower this time. "Your wife was not listed as deceased. Her profile was flagged, transferred to Experimental Cognition Reserve. Site designation, Orion." Logan stood voice cold. "Where is it?" "We don't know. The facility doesn't exist on any records. But she's not dead. Not in the way you were told." He didn't speak. Couldn't. The voice continued. "She's alive, Logan. Somewhere. She may not remember who she is, but the data confirms she exists." A click. The call ended. Logan stood in the dark room for a long time, his hands trembling. Shadow stirred from his mat, walked over slow but steady. He pressed his head against Logan's knee. Logan dropped to the floor, buried his face in the dog's fur, not in grief, not in rage, but in something fragile, something new, hope. And in the morning, when Ben asked why there was a map of South America on the cabin table, Logan simply said, "We've got one more mission." The snow hadn't stopped, not fully, but now it fell like dust, soft and unhurried, as if even the weather understood what kind of day this was. The 4 of them, Logan, Ben, Lyra, and Shadow, walked the last stretch in silence. There were no more enemies here, no more doors to kick and secrets to drag out of the dark, just snow and sky, and the rising sound of wind through pine trees. They reached the summit by mid-afternoon. It wasn't high by Alpine standards, but from this ridge you could see everything. Below them, in the fold of the valley, nestled among the shadows of pine and the silver-banked river, Hollow Light Sanctuary glowed like a lantern in the dusk. Dozens of children moved across the compound. Dogs barked playfully. Smoke curled upward from chimneys and outdoor fire pits. Volunteers moved between cabins, some hauling supplies, others just talking with the kids. To an outsider, it would have looked like a quiet retreat. To Logan, it was a battleground reborn, a place where the next war wasn't against men or machines, but forgetting. He knelt slowly in the snow joints, stiff bones worn. Shadow padded forward and sat beside him, his breath steaming gently in the cold. Ben crouched nearby, brushing snow off a flat rock and setting his latest model plane on its surface. Lyra stood with her sketchbook clutched tight to her chest, eyes wide, as she drank in the view. They stayed like that for a long time. No one said anything, and then Logan broke the silence. His voice low, rough with memory. "We didn't save the world." Ben looked over. Logan kept his gaze down on the valley. "But to those kids down there, we are the world." No one answered. They didn't have to. Shadow leaned against Logan's side, the weight of him familiar, now permanent. He nudged Logan's hand with his nose, once gently. Logan smiled, scratched behind the ears. "You remember the first time we met," he whispered. "You didn't bark. You didn't growl. Just looked at me like you already knew the way." Shadow licked his hand once, then looked upward, toward the snowfall, toward the sky. Ben followed his gaze. Then Lyra, then Logan. The clouds had split slightly, just enough to let a few ribbons of gold spill through, lighting up the treetops below like embers. The world was still broken, but for a moment, it looked like it knew how to begin again. Shadow's eyes reflected the light, steady and watchful, exactly like they had that first night on Logan's porch, as if he'd never forgotten the path, as if he'd always known where this would end. or where it must begin. The wind picked up slightly. The model plane wobbled on the rock. Ben reached out to steady it, then paused. "No," he said softly. "Let it go." And he did. The wind took it gently, lifted it upward. It soared in a slow arc across the ridge, then downward toward the lights below. Toward the children who would soon build their own. Logan stood watching it glide, and then, as if pulled from somewhere deeper than memory, his voice spoke again, this time quieter but resonant. A final message. Shadow wasn't a miracle, he said. He was a memory, living and breathing, of the things we're never allowed to forget. The screen slowly faded to black. But long after the final image disappeared, you could still hear the wind, and the sound of paws pressing gently into snow.